Good morning, everyone. My name's John Slow of Delta Energy and Environment. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm joined today by my colleague Rox Peterson. Hello, Rox.
Hi, John.
We're sitting in our Edinburgh office, just a couple of 100 metres from Edinburgh Castle, but the view from our window, unfortunately, doesn't look over the castle. It looks straight over a building 20 metres away. So we hope you're hearing us okay, and you should be able to see on the screen now the title for the webinar, Digital Sales Platforms, the Installer Perspective. We've got a lot of people joining. We'll get started in 2 or 3 minutes and keep to time, so we'll be no more than 40 minutes on the webinar altogether. And we've got a couple of polls for you, so you can vote and give your opinions. And Rox and I will be talking you through some of the research highlights on this really interesting topic. So you should be able to see on the right hand, on the control panel for the webinar, a way in which you can ask questions. So you can ask them just to us, or you can use a chat feature. We'll keep an eye out for your questions, and I can't promise that we'll answer every question you ask during the webinar. We'll try and answer as many as we can. And if we can't answer your question during the webinar, we will get back to you afterwards. So we can see more and more people joining, which is great. I make it now 10 o'clock. We'll give people just another minute to make sure they're online and dialed in, and then we'll get going. So although we're in Edinburgh, I have to say that neither Rox nor myself are from Edinburgh or Scotland. You can have a guess as we go through the webinar where we might be from, each of us, and maybe towards the end, Rox will we can tell people.
Yeah. I always get interesting guesses when people are guessing where I'm from.
You've got a much more interesting accent than I have.
Yeah, the accent really confuses people.
You should be able to see pictures of us on the webinar. We're not doing these live via webcam yet. We may do that in the future. So just give people another 20 seconds or so to join. We can see the numbers ticking up, and then we'll get going. So for those of you that have just joined, my name's John Slow, and I'm joined by my colleague Rox Peterson. On the control panel on the right, you will be able to ask us questions or use the chat feature during the webinar. Please feel free to do that, and we'll answer as many questions as we can during the webinar, and we'll follow up with you afterwards for the ones that we don't get a chance to answer. The webinar is being recorded, and if you would like a recording of the webinar and the slides, then please do send us an email, either to myself or to Rox or to the info address that I think you used to register for the webinar, and we'll get a slide set and link to the recording out to you. So I make it 2 minutes after 10. We'll get started, and we'll make sure we're wrapped up by 10:40 at the latest, and maybe even a little earlier to allow you to get a mid-morning cup of tea or coffee. We'll start with very quickly a couple of slides about Delta for those of you that don't know us. We have a simple mission, which is to help the energy and heating sectors navigate the transition from old energy to new energy. And the research today is coming from one of our 3 heat subscription services, as you can see in the middle. Moving on to the next slide, you can see the different types of work we do. I won't talk through all of this, and a sample of our client base. So this research is mainly focused on the UK. Our research does cover Europe, but today we'll be focusing on this UK-focused research. Okay, so 4 parts to the webinar. Brief introduction from my colleague Rox, who will be doing most of the talking and has done the hard work today, or hard work on this topic, on digital sales platforms. And then the meat of the research will be introducing the research we did and the survey results, and then some time at the end for questions. And as I said, about no more than 40 minutes in total. So let's start then by just making sure we're all on the same page for what digital sales platforms are. And I'm going to hand over to Rox to do that.
Thanks, John. So because digital sales platforms come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, we find it helpful to think of them on a kind of spectrum. At the one end, you've got your independent installers who do all their own advertising and handle each step of the customer acquisition and installation process on their own. Next, you have your online directories and lead generation sites such as Checkatrade. And these just help put customers and installers in contact with one another, but they don't do anything beyond that. Then you've got your home services platforms, and these are relatively new. Local Heroes is probably the most well-known, and you've also got big names like Amazon Home Services and John Lewis Home Solutions here. These sites offer all kinds of home services, not just boiler installations. But in the case of boiler installations, they usually just allow the customer to book a time that they want an installer to come and do a quote. So for other services, they'll also let the customer pay for the service through the platform. And then at the far end of the spectrum, you've got your boiler sales platforms like Boxed and HomeTree, which determine the customer requirements either in person or with a remote survey. They pick a boiler that's right for them, handle payments, and all the installer does is the actual installation. And in most cases, these platforms subcontract the installations out to independent installers. So some, like British Gas, do employ their installers directly.
So there's quite a spectrum of digital sales platforms, and I guess the most disruptive and the biggest change being on the right-hand side of that slide.
For now, yes.
We've got a sample of logos on here representing many of the companies active in the market. If yours isn't there, then apologies, and do
let us know, we'll add it.
Yeah. Thanks, Rox. So we've worked hard to look at this topic because we do see it's got a lot of potential. Well, it's already disrupting traditional heating sales channels and potential to disrupt them much more, in our opinion. But only if two things: only if they can create customer demand, and only if they can work with installers, because that's obviously, if they can't do that, you can't install the products. And for an installer, there are clearly benefits to subcontracting, saving time and money on advertising, for example, saving time on sales and quotes. But they're also giving up some of their role as well, some of the ownership of the customer relationship and control over their schedule and pricing, for example. So we wanted to find out what installers actually thought of this model, what they thought about subcontracting to digital platforms. And I'll let Rox explain briefly how we went about that.
Thanks, John. So the first thing that we did before actually doing our survey was we chatted to all the relevant players in the heating industry to get their views on what installers might think about subcontracting. These informed the questions we actually then asked installers in our online survey, and these were based around how installers get their work, what their pain points are, which tasks they would give up to third parties, and any concerns that they might have about subcontracting to third parties. Sample-wise, we limited the survey to sole traders and installers working for small local companies because we felt the questions weren't as relevant to those who are directly employed by regional or national companies. And then to get this survey out to installers, we advertised it through a range of different social media channels. We got 300 complete responses in total, which I was pretty impressed with, given that we ran it in midwinter. So for some of the earlier survey questions, we did actually have responses from over 600 installers. So it's a pretty good response rate.
Thanks. We've had one question just asking about whether the slides and recording will be available, and they will be. So if you would like the slides afterwards in a recording, then please drop Rox or myself an email, or to the info email address that you registered with for the webinar. So let's now look into some of the results, which I'm sure is what you're all on the webinar for. Starting with how we segmented these 300 installers. And segmentation in one way sounds easy, but we didn't determine the segments. We used, we analyzed the results and used a language called R to help us identify what the segments were coming out of the research we did.
Yeah, so once we had the results, we tried cutting the data in various different ways to analyze the responses, and I found it most helpful to split the installers up just based on how they get their work currently and how they think this will change. So the first segment you see here, the biggest one, which is 61% of installers, I called these the traditional installers. So they get no work by subcontracting now, and they don't think they will in the future. Then there were 36 installers, making up 12% of our sample, who don't get any work by subcontracting now, but they do think that they will in future. So I called these ones the progressive installers. And then there were 27% who already get some share of their work by subcontracting today. I was going to call these the converts, but then in the other responses, I saw they had some reservations about subcontracting. So I called them the engaged installers instead.
Rox, how representative, 300 is a good sample, but relatively small in terms of the overall number of installers in the UK. Absolutely. So how representative do you think this is?
So I was surprised that the number of engaged installers was so high, given the number of installs being done by digital sales platforms currently. And I think that's partly related to the fact that we advertised the survey on social media, which means that we would have reached a more sort of tech-savvy bunch of installers. But there's no other reason that we'd have a disproportionately high number of engaged installers. So I would say beyond how we reach installers, it's actually reasonably representative.
Yeah, so I wouldn't rely on the precise percentages, but I think the overall pattern is probably right.
Yeah.
Great. Now, Rox, for those that are the engaged installers, those that are already subcontracting, are they doing this as their main source of work, or are they using subcontracting to top up their traditional way of working?
So we asked the 81 engaged installers if they get a quarter, 2 quarters, 3 quarters or more of their work by subcontracting. And I'll pull up the results here for you to see. If you look at the last column, you can see that over half of the engaged installers said that it's less than a quarter. There were only 6 installers who said that it's more than 3 quarters, and just 1 said that they get all their work by subcontracting. We also asked how they think this will change in the future, and most installers said they think that they'll continue to get roughly the same share of their work this way, and about a third said that they think it will increase. And this is actually something we'd heard from one of the larger digital platforms, is that usually installers start with just a few jobs, and then once they see how convenient it is, then they start to take on more.
Thanks, Rox. So a reminder, you can ask us questions during the webinar using the questions feature, and you can send them just to us, so it won't be seen by everyone, but just by Rox and myself. So we've got a chunk of installers, Rox, who are subcontracting. What did we find out about who they're subcontracting to, or which platforms they're working with?
So we didn't ask exactly which platforms they're subcontracting to, but we did ask which ones they were aware of. Just trying to get the slides to change, but it seems to be stuck. There we go. I think I've got it now. So you can see the responses here, and these are the responses from all installers, not just the engaged ones. I was also surprised to see that there weren't big differences between traditional and engaged installers in terms of their awareness of the different platforms. So I had thought the engaged would be more aware, but it turned out they were much the same. So you can see here that the awareness levels are generally higher for the online directories like Check a Trade, which makes sense since around half of the installers said that they use these sites to get leads. Local Heroes is probably the most well-known of the home services sites. They've apparently been advertising a lot to installers recently. Though it's worth pointing out here that that's only 50% of installers who were aware of Local Heroes. More installers within Aware of Boxed, which has also invested a lot in their marketing, and then, of course, the more established names like HomeServe and British Gas.
I think what's interesting, if you look at Boxed, there's over 50% awareness rocks, and yet they've only launched in the last few years. So
yeah.
If I think of other industries, how quickly platforms like Uber or Airbnb have come to prominence, they can go from zero to very high awareness in short periods of time. And we're seeing that's similar for a company like Boxed and others as well, I'm sure.
Yeah. I think all their marketing is certainly paying off.
Yeah. Now, time for a poll. So we find it's a nice way for people to get engaged. And so a question for you, and don't worry, your vote, how you voted, won't be revealed to everyone. We aggregate the results. And we want to ask you a question about what you think installers said when they think about customer preferences, so customers' use of online platforms, and how they think what this will change. So let's look at the question there on your screen and the answers that we'll ask, the 4 answers we'll ask you to choose from. The last answer is not sure, so that's an easy one. So there's the first possible answer, that basically things won't change much. Customers will keep wanting to buy boilers in the old traditional way. I was going to say old-fashioned, but let's say traditional way, by contacting installers directly. The next option, most customers today want to contact an installer in the way they are used to doing, but in the future, most will want to do this online through a digital platform. And lastly, most customers want to do this online now, actually. Maybe they don't know they can. And we'll see demand for these digital platforms or end-to-end websites growing a lot in the future. Or don't know. So we'll launch the poll now. You should be able to see on your screen.
You will see an abbreviated version of the answers, though, because I couldn't actually write the entire response.
Yeah, they're quite long questions. Sorry about that. And feel free to select one now. As I said, your vote will stay confidential. Well, we actually do. We can delve into who voted for what, but that's not revealed on the webinar today, and we won't reveal that to anyone. So we can see now 70% of people have voted. We'll give you another few seconds. And
this is fascinating.
Yeah. We can see a clear pattern emerging, which we'll reveal very shortly. Okay, 5 seconds more to vote. And okay, we're over 80%, which is great. Up to 84%. So let's now reveal the results. And then we'll also show you what installers said.
Yeah, so let's close the poll. Now I'm going to share the results.
Okay, so now you can see the results. So clear consensus amongst most of you. And very, very few people actually thinking things won't change. So I think maybe we've got a skewed audience, Rox, of people who have chosen to join the webinar.
Wait until you see the installer responses.
But everyone thinking things will change in the future. Okay.
And 14% saying that the change has already happened and that's what customers want. Okay, so I'm going to show you the installer results now for comparison. Let me just hide the poll first.
And we'll share you this poll afterwards for those that want the slides as well, the results of the poll. So we can still see the poll. Let's just try and make sure we can get rid of the poll and get back to the slides. Bear with us 1 second.
I don't know why it's not showing.
We'll try just sharing it and closing it again. So, sorry, bear with us while we just try and work out how to get rid of the the poll results from your screen, which normally is straightforward, but it's not behaving today. And then,
what can we do?
so while we're doing that, I'll let Rox play about with the webinar software and look at a couple of questions that have come in. One question about, did we find installers use platforms very regionally? Good question, and short answer is we don't know. We didn't.
No, I do know.
Oh, we do know, Rox, sorry.
I asked which regions each of the installers were working in, so your traditional and your engaged installers, and there weren't any significant differences from the overall group. So I thought that you would see more down in London in the southeast, because that's where some of the platforms are based, but there were no sort of clear regional differences between those who are engaged and those who aren't.
Okay. Question on how many people answered the poll, nearly 100. And a question about how in step the UK is with the rest of Europe. Is UK leading or lagging? And it's a good question. We see this trend across Europe. So not in every market, but in many markets, these models are emerging in Germany, in France, in Italy. I think the UK is towards the leading end, but other countries for sure are maybe at similar levels or not too far behind. And now we're back to the slides.
I've got the results.
Well done, Rob.
All right, so now I'm going to show you how the installer responses compared. If you look at the bottom bar here, that's all the installers in total. 55% of them said that customers want to go direct and they will always want to go direct, compared to just 3% of our webinar audience. Then there were about 30% who went with option B, that customer preferences will change, compared to 80% of our webinar audience. And then similar to the webinar audience, there's 5% of installers who think that customers already want to buy online. And what I thought was really interesting here, actually, is the difference in responses from the progressive installers who don't currently subcontract but think that they will in future. 60% of them see customer preferences changing, and we reckon that's one reason that they think they'll have to adapt and subcontract in future. I was also actually surprised by the responses from the engaged installers, as I thought more would think that customers want to buy online now, but it seems that actually most of them recognize that these customers are possibly in the minority and might remain so for at least the next few years.
And I think even if you look at the traditional installers here, there's unsurprisingly 2/3 of them think things won't change, but there's a chunk of traditional installers that recognize that I think many customers will find it much more appealing to go online, fill out some information, upload some photos, maybe a video, and that's again looking at other industries, the sort of experience that customers are increasingly used to these days.
Yeah, it is something that customers are starting to expect in all sorts of different domains. Okay,
so we've seen most installers think things won't change, and like many people, change is hard. So what objections do installers have, Roxanne, to subcontracting?
So the one thing that came through really strongly, especially in the written comments from installers, was that they're really concerned about the installation quality of the jobs being done by these sorts of platforms. They were very against the site surveys being done remotely by anybody other than the heating engineer. Some also suggested that it's only poorly trained engineers who are subcontracting and who don't do good quality installations and who skip steps like flushing the system and filling out benchmark in order to keep prices down. In the comments, there were like 10 installers who complained that this is a race to the bottom by lowering the prices that customers expect to pay. Pay was then obviously another key objection, as you'd expect, since installers are used to having control over the prices that they charge for their labor, and they can put up a markup on the equipment. This also came across in the comments, actually, with installers complaining that digital platforms are an unnecessary middleman and just another mouth to feed in the value chain. And then The other thing that installers felt strongly about was retaining ownership of the customer relationship, which is partly related to the fact, of course, that they get subsequent work through their customers, but quite a few also said in the comments again that they felt that they offered better personal service than what customers can get from digital platforms.
So some key concerns, but we've got some fascinating results coming up, which looks at the sort of jobs that installers would be willing to give up to third parties, and by inference, the sort of jobs they really don't want to give up to third parties. So, Rox, tell us a bit more about what sort of things installers are willing to give up and how models could work that will address installer concerns that you talked us through while keeping up with what customers want.
So I'll bring up a chart now with lots of results about all the questions we asked installers about what they would be willing to give up to a third party. So the two darker blue lines here are the agree and strongly agree responses. And if I grey some of those out, you can see that down at the bottom, you've got the things that installers are most against, like letting third parties do the site survey with online questionnaires or video calls or even in person. And you can also see the objections to letting a third party fix their prices. But then up at the top, we had almost 50% of installers saying that they would let a third party handle payment from the customer for a price decided by the installer, of course, as well as select the product brand and arrange the delivery of equipment and fittings. And interestingly, we've actually just seen Gustabosch trying out a kind of hybrid model now with the recent launch of their Express 72 service, which gives installers more flexibility over what price they charge and lets them have more sort of ownership of the customer relationship. So I thought that was a really interesting sort of industry development.
Yeah, it is interesting, Rox, because the new entrant platforms, I guess, don't have any incumbent business or channels to look after.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see Gustabosch, who's gone down the traditional route in the past, as have all the boiler manufacturers or heating industry, now starting to change that and going more direct, but not, I guess, completely direct.
Yeah, because they've got interests to protect that the likes of like Boxed and Hometree don't have. You know, they've got very loyal installers and they want to retain that loyalty. Whereas if you're a Boxed or a Hometree, you don't have that same concern that you can focus primarily on providing exactly what the customer wants.
Yeah. Okay, so before we move on to questions from the audience, from all of you on the line, overall, from the research we've done, do you think installers see digital sales platforms as a threat or an opportunity? So maybe a bit simplistic, but can you tell us what you think about that?
Yeah, so one of the last questions we asked installers was whether they think they should resist or embrace these websites. And if you look at the bottom bar here with all the installers, you can see that overall 42% think that they should be resisted, so kind of indicating that they think that they're a threat. Mm-hmm. Then there were 30% who don't think they need to do anything, either because they've already embraced them actually, or because they don't think that they're really going to affect the market. And then there was about a quarter who said that they should embrace them, suggesting that these platforms could be kind of embraced as a part of a bespoke marketing strategy, as the one installer said in the comments.
Okay, so yeah, I think we've learnt in our customer research there's no such thing as the customer, and likewise we've learnt in this research there's no such thing as the installer. There are differences and different segments, but it's been fascinating digging into some highlights of that, Rox. So we've got some questions that we'll come to that people have asked using the questions feature. So if you've got a question, please do let us know by sending it through. What we've shown you is highlights from a report we published under our Heat Insight service. So we're giving you some highlights and from the research. Any subscribers that are on the line, you of course can go onto our website and get the full details of the research, and we'd be happy to talk to any of you about it. One question here about the brands that we showed at the beginning, and how many of these are genuine new entrants or third parties? or how many are utilities or energy suppliers that have just got a brand or white label front for this? And it's an interesting question. With a company like Checkatrade, for example, is now owned by HomeServe.
Yeah.
So that's an existing one of the main players in the servicing market and insurance market who's looking to move into these digital platforms.
And then you've got players like Hoppy and Local Heroes who are actually with British Gas and EDF.
Yeah. Company like Hometree is completely independent and has raised money from some interesting investors. So we've got a mix, I think, of incumbent heating industry players, a few utilities, and a lot of new entrants.
Yeah.
I think is the best way to answer that question. Another question here about the age profile of installers. So is it true, Rox, that it's a younger, less experienced installers who are mostly subcontracting? Can you tell us a bit about that engaged segment?
So they're definitely younger and less experienced on average. So our engaged installers, almost 40% of them had less than 5 years of experience, compared to the traditional installers who mostly had over 10 years of experience. But then there was another 40% or so of the engaged installers who also had over 10 years of experience. So it's not purely down to age. Lots of the people we spoke to thought that this would be the case, except the platforms themselves, who knew that they have installers of all ages working for them.
Okay, so there is a pattern that the engaged installers are generally younger.
On average, yeah.
On average, but not by no means exclusively so.
Yeah, so they're not exclusively younger or less experienced installers. You do have installers who've been in the industry for decades.
Yeah. Okay. We've got another question here about district heating and whether we looked at the implication that will have as district and communal heating grows. We didn't. District and community heating is a few percent of the overall installed base in the UK at the moment. It's probably a bit higher than that in terms of new installations. We expect it to grow, but we think the huge majority of the market in the next years will continue to be individual heating systems. And then let's look at one more question around, so we've got a lot of questions to choose from here, so we need to get back to some of you. Do we have research regarding end users that means this trend will accelerate or not in terms of customers wanting to use digital sales platforms? And that's a question we have looked into in the past.
We did in 2017.
Yeah.
Sort of when these platforms had just started launching, they were very new. So when we asked customers then, we asked our customer panel, we had 700 homeowners responding. And I think 50% of them said that they know a local installer personally who they would go to for their next boiler installation. And something like 2% said that they would go online. And I'm really keen to repeat that research now, that these platforms are like increasing the number of installations they do, to see if customer awareness has picked up since we last did it in 2017.
So that will take us on to another poll that we're about to ask.
Yes.
In my view, I think the proposition is great for some customer types, for sure, not all customer types.
It's particularly appealing to landlords, actually.
Yeah. We've got another question about the volumes. So I think without going into too much detail, there are certainly tens of thousands of boilers that are being bought in some way through the digital platforms that you showed at the beginning.
Yeah, so out of 1.5 million installs done in a year, British Gas does maybe 100,000 of those, and then your platforms are maybe a fraction of that, sort of 10% of that.
Yeah, so growing quickly, but still small in terms of overall numbers in the market. Okay, so the next poll is partly doing us a bit of a favour, but we'd be very grateful if you'd tell us, and it'll be interesting for you to see what others in the industry think, which research topics you would like us to focus on in terms of the research we do under our research service. So we've got some topics here, and if you can vote in the normal way, I won't talk through them all. And as I said, no one on the webinar will see your results, and we won't reveal that to anyone. We've got a reasonable number. It's making you think a bit, this question. The percentages voted are going up a bit more slowly, so we'll give you another 10 seconds or so.
This one they can vote for multiple options, actually.
Okay, and you can tick more than one box here.
Yeah.
So the numbers will add up to more than 100. Okay, so we're nearly at the 80% mark again. Another couple of seconds. Okay, over 80%, and we'll close the poll. And you will see that there's, I guess, broad interest across these top 3 topics. Heat as a service, which we're doing some research on at the moment.
We have focus groups coming up soon on heat as a service, actually.
Okay, so that's 4 focus groups?
Yes.
To really understand how homeowners will think about heat as a service. More research on the sales channel, picking up the question we just talked about, Rox.
Mm-hmm.
And then how IoT with connected heating controls, remote diagnostics on boilers is changing the heating sector. And we actually have some research on this at a European level under our Connected Home service. Okay, thanks very much. As I said earlier, we'll put the polls in the slide pack if you'd like a copy of the slides, and you can ask us for that. We're 10:34, so nicely within my promise to close the webinar by 10:40. And a couple of things to highlight. We have a podcast at Delta now, so as well as hearing our insights via webinar, if you're not too sick of my voice, then you can hear myself and key leaders from the energy and heating sectors on our new podcast, which is available via all the usual podcast channels, Spotify, iTunes, etc. And our Heat Summit, which last year was in Berlin, and this year we're delighted to have in London in September. Last but not least, where are we from? So I'm very boring and just from London.
And I'm from South Africa originally.
So well done if you guessed that right. As I mentioned, drop us an email or use the info address that you registered for if you'd like a copy of the slides and a link to the recording. We're always interested to discuss these topics, so please do drop us a note if you've got any comments, questions, anything you disagree with, and we'll get back to you if you ask the question that we didn't manage to get to on today's webinar. So I think that's everything from us. Thank you very much for joining. Thanks. We appreciate the time you've given up, and we hope in return you've learned something or had your views confirmed and go back to your day with a few new ideas.